Welcome back to 112 Biology with M.Hook. We're going to look at Chapter 14. It relates very well to Chapter 13. In there we looked at how populations evolve, how one species changes over time. Chapter 14 looks at biological diversity, so different species and how they form. So that would be called macroevolution. We're going to look at that in several different ways. We'll look at the changes that have occurred throughout the world's history, mostly done with the fossil record. We'll look at the different species. So speciation is the focal point of macroevolution. What that means is that's what happens during macroevolution. We're no longer just focusing on one species. It's where an ancestor has some sort of divide, and that causes two new species to form. We're going to look at the patterns that can occur for that. So you've got a non-branching evolution where you've got the original species, and then you have a new species. You've also got branching, where the common ancestor branches out to different new species. So species means a kind. And we all kind of think we know what a species is, but it's actually very difficult for scientists to determine what's a species and what's not. They're constantly looking for like new insect species. How can you tell if they look very similar? Ernst Mayr, he has the idea of a biological species concept, and that's the one that we're going to talk about the most. You can also have like a morphological species concept based on looks. So biological species concept means the species is a group of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. Okay, so what does that mean? First, they can interbreed. When members of the same group, the same species come together, they can produce viable offspring. And they do mate together. They can be reproductively isolated from others that, if put together, would breed but otherwise wouldn't. So like here we have eastern and western meadowlarks, where they don't come in contact at all, so they wouldn't be considered the same species. They don't interbreed. And then there's diversity within one species, so you can see different morphological views, different phenotypes, but all people on the earth can interbreed with each other. So we're the same species. What are some situations where biological species concept doesn't work? Asexual organisms, you can't really tell if something is the same species as another if they can't interbreed because they're asexual. Fossils, we can't see fossils and how they were able to reproduce together. So how do species remain separate? What are these reproductive barriers that stop us from interbreeding? You can have prezygotic and postzygotic barriers. So prezygotic means before fertilization, and postzygotic means after fertilization. So prezygotic, they impede mating or they don't allow the eggs to get fertilized. Examples, temporal isolation. If you have an animal that mates in the morning and is active, it wouldn't ever mate with a nocturnal animal. They're not active during the same time of the day. You could also have seasonal isolation there for temporal. So if one species breeds in the spring and the other in the fall, they could possibly produce fertile offspring, but they would never mate together. Also habitat isolation if they don't have the same habitat. And behavioral isolation. If there's a very specific mating dance, like with birds, think about the different mating rituals that they have. If it's not properly conducted, those individuals wouldn't mate. Fireflies have very specific lighting structures that they use for mating. If they don't see the right matching up sequence, they're not going to mate with that individual. And then mechanical isolation. Physically, they can't come together. Their parts don't fit. And gametic isolation. So even if the sperm and the egg were near each other, they wouldn't form a zygote. They wouldn't fuse together properly. Here's an example of behavioral blue-footed boobies, and the dance that they do would only work on other blue-footed booby females. It wouldn't work on other birds. Here's an example of that. I didn't pick this music. So it's a bit of their dance. You also have postzygotic barriers. So you've had the egg and sperm to come together and make a zygote, but they can't make any new offspring after that point. So examples there, hybrid inviability, if you can't have the zygote fully develop, if there would be like an abortion occurring, or hybrid sterility. So a mule is a hybrid of a horse and a donkey that can't reproduce. So they can have one generation there, but you can't have more than that. So this is a nice summary. You've got the pre-zygotic barriers. You have some that occur before mating where they just will never mate together. You've got after mating, you can't put the parts together properly or the gamete can't form. And then after the zygote forms from the gametes merging, you have the postzygotic. Either the zygotes don't develop or the hybrids are sterile and can't reproduce. So how do we get new species then? You need some sort of event when the population becomes separated. You've got one species that separates somehow, and then you can get new species. So here's a few examples of ways this happens. You have allopatric and sympatric speciation. Allopatric speciation means that the two are physically separated. So you've got a parent species that was separated, like these squirrels were separated by the Grand Canyon. They couldn't cross to the other side. So the two populations of the same species have evolved and are no longer mating together. They're no longer be called a biological species. Get new populations when you don't have reproduction occurring between the two populations of the same species. So there's some sort of reproductive barrier, either the post-zygotic or pre-zygotic that we looked at. So sympatric, instead of allopatric, occurs in the same spot. You've got two new species forming right next to each other. There's no separation. So how does this happen? You have mutants that are no longer reproductively viable with their offspring. So this is generally going to occur more in plants. If you have plants that are reproducing, they'll go through mitosis and meiosis, they can have an error where things don't separate properly. Instead of diploid, they can become triploid or even tetraploid, where they have an extra copy of each chromosome. So here we have a species when it's diploid, it's got two chromosomes, it's got two pairs of two chromosomes. And at the end, you've got this fertile hybrid that has 10. Then that individual could breed if another one had the same mutation, and you could have sympatric speciation. We do this a lot with domestic plants. We make hybrids in between different individuals with new numbers of chromosomes. What is the tempo or rate of speciation? This is up for debate a little bit. So usually they showed this like slow change over time. So you'd slowly have these differences occurring. They'd get a little bit more different all the time. That's the more gradualistic way. But there's another idea called punctuated equilibrium, which means that for the most part, there's very little evolution occurring. It's very, very slow, and then you'll have a time of rapid evolution and diversion into new species. And that would be an idea of why there are less transitional fossils. So here, you could have speciation occurring really rather quickly. This is where I'd take a break and ask you what accounts for the evolution of biological novelty, these new species. Why would this happen? I want you to think about it for a second. Think about how we get new physical traits, for example. Pause video, think. Okay, hopefully we would have had a lovely discussion on this, and we can start going through some ideas. First, you can adapt old structures for new functions. So birds, aves, they come from reptiles. And they developed from flightless ancestors, but how? There's Archaeopteryx, the fossil that I showed last time in chapter 13. How did we get these feathers? It's called exaptation. That's where you take a structure that evolved for one context, for one function, and is slowly adapted for others. So that could be feathers. Think about even if a bird can't go straight from being a reptile on the ground to flying, you could have all these in-betweens. You could have the ability to go up a little bit, and those would maybe have an advantage over the others until the better flyers, the thinner their bones, the more successful they were. And then over a long period, you can have this change. We've also got the origin of tetrapods here. That's of four-legged creatures. And we looked at Tiktaalik a little bit before, where you saw these different limbs starting to form from fish. So there's Tiktaalik. A fun example for birds, there's a bird that looks a lot like the picture from the last slide here, where it has wing-like claws. Here's a video showing Archaeopteryx and some of our current birds that look like that, the Hoatzin. It's narrated by David Attenborough. If you don't know who he is a British naturalist who studies nature and has made amazing documentaries. He's a wonderful person to narrate videos. So that's an example of exaptation, taking a structure for one function that slowly gives rise to feathers. Another possible way for new traits is evo-devo, development and evolutionary novelty, and that's based on the developmental genes and small changes. So an example there is paedomorphosis. That means that you contain your juvenile traits into adulthood. So that's an axolotl. It's a salamander. And most salamanders have this juvenile state where they have their external gill slits before leaving the water and being mostly terrestrial. Axolotls don't. They stay in the water and look like a juvenile, even though they become sexually mature. This idea is very important for evolution of humans. You'll also see the word neoteny as well. Humans, it's idealized that we have a paedomorphosis of our skull. We don't ever fully develop these thickened bones and protruding jaw that primates do in other species. And then Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse, for example, is an example of paedomorphosis in that he retains these youthful characteristics of a child rather than an adult mouse. Macroevolution, the speciation of different species, is tied with the history of the Earth. We have to understand both for macroevolution to really make sense. And how we do that is we look at the fossil record and we look at the tectonic plate movement. This holds the history of what happened in the Earth's crust. Based on what we found in fossils, geologists have established what's called a geologic time scale, reflecting these different geologic periods. So here's the geologic time scale. We'll continue discussing this in the next video.